Dr. Ahimsa Porter Sumchai.
And Doctor, why don't you talk about your early life growing up in Hunters Point Bayview, your history, and also your father and what brought you to the situation?
Well, I am involved in an ongoing issue around environmental justice in general in the Bayview Hunters Point Southeast community regions of San Francisco, where I did grow up. And specifically, my focus has been on the remediation and development activities at the Hunters Point Shipyard and the health and safety risks that have been posed by that development. I did grow up in public housing in three areas of Southeast San Francisco. We started out in Potrero Hill, and then moved over to Sunnydale, and then I lived for a short period of time with my dad on Silver Avenue in the Bayview area while I was finishing up my medical school training. And
Your father.
yeah, my dad, George Donald Porter, handsome guy, wonderful smile. He died prematurely of pulmonary asbestosis contributed to his death, and as a result of his death, he had a medical record that contributed to a civil suit. He had worked as a longshore walking boss. He had worked as a shipping clerk for American President Lines at the shipyard. He used to come home from the shipyard, I remember, as early as age 5, carrying his metal lunch pail with his big worker boots on, and I remember his photo albums. I couldn't believe, he would have just photo after photo of, the shipyard and the ships and, the working conditions. And without question, he influenced me. People often comment that my writing is very, scripted and fine, and it's the kind of, penmanship that you see in people who are clerks. And I'm sure that, he influenced me in that area. He also influenced me as a reader, at a young age. I found my dad dead in 1992, and I am the physician of record on his death certificate. And when he died, I requested his medical record, and there was an X-ray that demonstrated clear evidence of pulmonary fibrosis, and ultimately it was determined that it was due to asbestosis. And again, there was a class action suit that stemmed from his death and harm that was due to other workers. I got involved in environmental justice issues in Bayview pretty early. Most of my involvement was around the old Hunters Point power plant. I don't know if you recall that it exploded in the late 90s, and metaphorically that was a galvanizing effect on the community. And then the shipyard had a similar galvanizing experience in the year 2000, the Parcel E2 landfill, a toxic landfill that to date has pockets near its surface that contain up to 50% methane gas caught on fire in August, which is an area in time of the year when it's very, very hot.
Now, for people who don't know about the Hunters Point Naval Shipyard, when did it start as a military shipyard, and what? Excuse me. So, what effect is that what was going on there as far as the development of the shipyard have on the community?
Well, the shipyard has an incredible history as a seaport. It goes back to the 1800s, but the actual designation as a naval shipyard occurred prior to the United States entry into World War II, and it was as a result of information that suggested that the Pacific Rim and the Pacific area would be a likely theater for combat. African Americans, primarily from the South, Texas, Louisiana, were recruited in very large numbers to come to California to work in the shipyard, and there was housing that was built to support these workers, and that housing continues as the housing developments around the shipyard in Potrero Hill and the largest public housing development in the Sunnydale area. And the shipyard was the site of seaport activities and shipbuilding. One of the most significant events that involves the shipyard's history is in the post-World War II area, the Bikini Atoll detonations. There were two mega blast detonations that occurred in the Bikini Atoll, and those ships that were deliberately exposed to ionizing radiation were hauled back to the Hunters Point Treasure Island Naval Station. It functioned at that time as a combined naval station. It's important to remember that historically, because some of the information that's being unveiled around radiological contamination at Treasure Island is likely very credible, just based on the history that we know that those naval stations operated at that era and in time as a combined naval station.
So they used these ships. They tested these ships with the nuclear blasts in that area, and then they towed them back to San Francisco. And what happened to the ships here in Hunters Point Bay?
They were many of the ships were sandblasted in an effort to try to decontaminate them, and the sandblast that has been an issue of residual contamination at the shipyard was a source of radium-226. It's called Black Beauty sandblast, and the fuel from the ships that contained byproducts of fission, like plutonium and strontium-90, was actually burned over power plants and, was in the atmosphere. And that's why there are levels of radioactive materials in soil that are above, background levels. And some of the ships were, they were deconstructed, and the parts were buried in landfills, and that's the issue. It's known that the Parcel E2 landfill that is adjacent to the southeastern shore of the shipyard contains radium dials and other materials that were accumulated as a result of the deconstruction of these ships that had been, again, deliberately exposed to massive levels of ionizing radiation.
And there was a radioactive laboratory there. What was that?
Of course. The Naval Radiological Defense Laboratories were established in the post-World War II era specifically to investigate the impacts of radiation exposure. And there was a variety of testing that was being done. Initially, it was being done with very lax supervision by the Atomic Energy Commission, so that the scientists of the NRDL who were working in laboratories located along Crisp Avenue, which was like the main drag into the shipyard it exists today, were pouring effluents of radioactive waste into their drains of their laboratories, and these drains communicate with the storm drain system throughout the shipyard and in adjacent regions, and we know that they discharge into San Francisco Bay. So that has been a significant source of ongoing radiation exposure. And one of the things that we were able to do on the Restoration Advisory Board of the Hunters Point Shipyard in 2001, I founded the Radiological Subcommittee of the Hunters Point Shipyard because at that time, the information about radiological operations that had previously been classified became public, and so the extent of radiological operations was, pretty significant. And one of the things that we were able to achieve through our advocacy was to force the Navy to pull the sanitary storm drains and sewer system, although there are some drain systems that are still in place, at the shipyard that have been a source of controversy. In fact, in 2015, the City and County of San Francisco accepted land transfers from the shipyard, parcels UC1, 2, and D2, and these were parcels that had been cut out of Parcel A, where there is now residential development, because of known radiological contamination. The city accepted them, and we now know that the city accepted these properties with knowledge by the regulatory agencies that the clearances had been falsified. About 75% of the soil samples in this area had been falsified as part of the Tetra Tech radiological fraudulent, soil sample investigation that's ongoing.
And the children, the families in Hunters Point Bayview, what has been the health effects on them living next to this highly contaminated laboratory and military base?
Well, the most prevalent, well-documented, and irrefutable effects have been the cardiopulmonary impacts of exposures to toxic air contaminants and volatile organic compounds. While there's a great deal of emphasis on radiological operations and secondary radiation exposures, not only to community but to workers and people who are on the shipyard, the most immediate impacts that are being seen are as a result of the particulates that are being generated through the the development and the remediation activities, the hauling of soil out of the shipyard via trucks. That's been an ongoing issue. When you look at the health statistics, there's always been a disparity in asthma incidences, in incidences of cardiopulmonary diseases, heart attacks, congestive heart failure that are associated with this excess burden of disease associated with exposure, to tox, volatile organic compounds. Lead is one of the most significant residual contaminants. In fact, the Parcel A segment of the shipyard that was transferred in 2004 for residential development was transferred despite an ongoing conflict that had gone on between the Department of Public Health and the Navy about residual soil samples that showed elevations in lead. The lead in the soil was at cleanup level when Parcel A was transferred, and that's well documented in the Parcel A record of decision.
And the workers who worked at this site, the shipyard workers that were doing the sandblasting, were they informed about the dangers of radioactive material?
Well, according to the historical radiological assessment, a lot of the human subjects, and there was an enormous amount of human subject experimentation. In fact, it was clearly unethical, and if it weren't for the embryonic state of atomic Energy Commission regulation during that era, it certainly couldn't have been conducted today. I saw research where men were exposed orally to radioactive potassium, which, by the way, is elevated in the soil at the shipyard, to see what impact it would have on their muscle mass. As you know, muscles function as a result of, potassium.
So they were actually testing the workers at that site with radioactive material?
There were volunteers for human subjects, and according to the historical radiological assessment, many of them were workers at the shipyard who, either unknowingly or with motivation, perhaps they received monetary incentive, perhaps they got the impression they couldn't keep their jobs if they didn't participate. But yes, there was one experiment that I referenced that is, irrefutably documented, where, healthy men were administered radioactive potassium to see the impact it would have on their muscle mass. And there was a lot of radiological experiments conducted, on animals, during the era. So again,
This was in the 1950s?
this was about, 46 through, oh my goodness, I think NRDL activities continued to about 1974.
So that's decades.
Yes, yeah. And of course, the regulations became, more scrutinizing. But again, many of the activities that were going on in settings that, were semi-secret. It's important to identify that scientists from UC Berkeley and Stanford, were participating in the NRDL activities.
Now, this land was obviously highly contaminated. It had been used for decades for investigations of radiation, the effect of radiation on animals, on human beings. There had been massive sandblasting, which we talked about, of radioactive material off the ships into the environment, into the ground. Under these circumstances, how could and why did the government and politicians decide that they wanted to privatize it and turn it over to developers?
It's a complex history. I sent you an article that I wrote. It was one of the most widely circulated articles I've ever written for the SF Bayview. It was written in I think I wrote that in 2009, Singing in the Rain, How the Hunters Point Shipyard Enriched Political Families. And what happened is clearly documented in the San Francisco Chronicle. In April of 2004, a writer documented that the extent of radiological operations at the shipyard were not known until they were declassified. And the Navy itself compiled with Tetra Tech the historical radiological assessment. I have comments in all three iterations of the HRA. There are copies of the HRA right here in the corner we can get some footage of. But until the HRA was published, and the final HRA wasn't published until 2004, the year of the Parcel A transfer in San Francisco city government, the extent of radiological operations simply wasn't known. And what happened was that the Navy itself had cold feet about transferring the property. The United States Navy,
Because they knew it was highly dangerous.
knew that it wasn't safe. And there is a well-documented exchange that occurred between Gavin Newsom, who at that time was mayor of San Francisco and had conflict of interest issues in his family.
What were those conflicts of interest?
He has a relationship that is familial with Nancy Pelosi, and Nancy Pelosi has a relative, Lawrence Pelosi, who was initially in charge of the acquisition of the shipyard, by the city and county of San Francisco, and Lawrence Pelosi moved over from that position with Lennar in 2004 at the start of the transfer. And so Nancy Pelosi, along with Diane Feinstein, who I understand chaired a military housing committee and had some problems with her chairmanship with her husband, Richard Blum, who is a developer who is expert in military housing.
That's Perini Construction Company?
I believe that's the name of the construction company. So to make a long story short, in January of 2004, there was a big conveyance agreement that was signed in Washington, D.C., and there was a big fanfare and potentially embarrassing fanfare, and it had involved Pelosi and Brown and Newsom. And then when the Navy got cold feet about transferring the property, according to the San Francisco Chronicle, Nancy Pelosi, started twisting arms with people on military appropriations and within the Department of Defense to make sure that the property was transferred. So that was the backdrop in January of 2004. Going into the transfer of Parcel A to the city and county of San Francisco. And after that, it was a steamroller. It was a political steamroller. It just rolled through City Hall. It rolled through with...
And how did that happen? I mean, talk about the
money and people getting, bribes, and I documented it.
Who got bribes?
The woman who was the executive director of the Bayview Opera House was also the chair of the planning commission, and there was a huge amount of money that went to the board of directors of the Bayview Opera House that was not documented in the records, that was the subject of an ethics committee complaint. There were members of the board of supervisors. One person is still on the board who,
Who was that?
Aaron Peskin had received a contribution. It was difficult to identify it as, cause and effect, quid pro quo. But, there were, people like that. But, outwardly it was evident that people like, Diane Feinstein, people like Pelosi, even Gavin Newsom. Gavin Newsom, as mayor, introduced the shipyard legislation to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. He introduced it. He was the sponsor of Board of Supervisors legislation to, transfer the shipyard. So yeah, it just...
And he was aware, of course, that there were these health problems and other concerns.
The health problems were well documented. The environmental impact review of the shipyard transfer actually documented that the increase in particulates, toxic air contaminants would be expected to be worsened. But what they did was they passed it anyway because of the special benefits that would be derived economically and financially, from the development of the shipyard.
And there's city departments, Department of Toxins and other city health departments. What has been the role of the Department of Public Health in the city and county of San Francisco?
The Department of Public Health's role has been totally and completely reprehensible, and I have been a spokesperson about the role that the health department has played. There have been hearings, there have been investigations. Mitch Katz, the former director of the Department of Public Health, I believe left and went to Los Angeles as a result of pressures that he faced, not only around the shipyard. There were some other issues at Laguna Honda. There were problems for him, but the timing of his leaving coincided coincided with some of the, revelations around, the toxic impacts and exposures. The most serious violator in the San Francisco Department of Public Health, who has the longest history, is Amy Brownell, the soil mitigation engineer in the Environmental Division. Amy Brownell is as essential to the shipyard's development as Tetra Tech. We were talking about the relationship between the Tetra Tech and the Navy. Tetra Tech is the major contractor, and they are effectively married. They, are physically adjacent to one another in the locations in San Diego. But similarly, Amy Brownell is probably the most important person in the San Francisco Department of Public Health who is aligned with the corruption and probably the fraud that we now know has existed in the collection of the soil samples. And it makes sense. We just can't imagine, or you can't expect anyone to believe that thousands and thousands of fraudulent soil samples, the more they look, the more they find.
Well, let's get into that, because already approximately $1 billion has been spent on Tetra Tech on so-called remediation of this site, and now Treasure Island. What happened in that process of remediation, trying to remove the dangerous toxins and other elements?
They were trying to do it quickly, and they were doing it quickly for a number of reasons. One, there was a political will and an enormous political driving force to remediate the property as quickly as possible and transfer it for development purposes. And then their contract compensation, was centered on them completing, jobs and tasks. So, there was an incentive, and there was probably also the intelligent awareness that I have and you have that this is not habitable property. As, again, an elected member of the Restoration Advisory Board of the Hunters Point Shipyard and founding chair of the Radiological Subcommittee, it was obvious to me that this was not property that was safe for human habitation. This is a federal superfund site. This is one of the dirtiest properties in the country. To be a federal superfund site is a significant declaration in terms of its, potential for, harm to, to human health and the environment. So, the workers, the administrators, the regulators, at some point, these are intelligent people, and they know that this is not property that is ever going to be safe, for little kids to, live in, or to, grow, vegetable gardens, in the backyard patio. So that is probably another realistically, driving force around the fraud. That, at some point these workers say, well, look, all of the soil here has elevations in radioactive potassium. There's radium-226 in most of these soil samples. How are we going to clear this beach, of all of this toxic material, and get paid at the end of the day,
So we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars, paid to this company. And,
Right.
and what happened is that some of these workers began to say that there were improper things being done?
Yes, it was clearly massively orchestrated to have fraudulent soil samples collected, and we're now talking about specifically the Tetra Tech report that spanned, I think the first fraudulent samples or anomalous soil samples were detected by the Navy laboratory computers in 2008, and then they, went, forward and looked at other samples. But, the extent of the, contamination is, just of such a large scale. And the orchestration of the activities clearly gives us evidence that there were a lot of people involved, and we know that a lot of those people were in the Tetra Tech company. But my concern is that there is very, very strong likelihood that there was, the popular word is collusion, between the health department and possibly, the, Board of Supervisors, even mayor's office. Again, I think that it's impossible that Amy Brownell, the soil mitigation engineer in the Department of Public Health, would not have been aware of an activity of this, grand scale.
So NBC Bay Area, other news sources have had a large number of stories about these whistleblowers, including Michael Madry, who was a quality assurance manager for Test America, which was also doing tests which were falsified on Hunters Point, Bayview, and Treasure Island. And this was in the newspapers in San Francisco. It was on radio.
Yes.
And the Board of Supervisors, did any of them ever say that there should be a halt to the development, or there should be an investigation of these whistleblowers' complaints who said that they were being retaliated against precisely for refusing to falsify the testing of the site?
There has never been an effort to implement a moratorium on development at the shipyard, and I believe that ultimately that's where we're heading, that is the issue. My personal belief is the belief I've always upheld, that there should be a moratorium on residential development without question. I don't see any justification for believing that there is any evidence that supports safe residential development at this point. The mayor and the D10 supervisor, Malia Cohen, of course, did respond to the Navy and the regulators' decisions not to accept further transfers. And, Ed Lee's language was actually pretty stern on the issue. In about 2007, the San Francisco Board of Education, as a result of enormous complaints that were coming from teachers and janitors and school nurses and parents and kids with coughs and bloody noses and worsening asthma as a result of the grading, activities, did pass a resolution unanimously calling for a halt on the development. But of course, when it got to the Board of Supervisors, with the influence of people like D10 Supervisor Sophie Maxwell, who was very invested personally and professionally and politically in the project, it failed. But I do think that we are looking at a call for a moratorium on residential development at the shipyard.
And London Breed, what role did she have? She was president of the Board of Supervisors?
London Breed came on the Redevelopment Commission in 2005 specifically to advance the shipyard's development. And that is a fact that was memorialized in an article written by Willie Radcliffe, publisher of the SF Bayview newspaper. And Breed has acted to, advance the shipyard. Breed appeared in multiple social media ads promoting a campaign, to expand, office use at the shipyard. And it was quite ironic because the NBC investigative team was, blasting, these news reports about the Tetra Tech findings at that time. And you still had people like London Breed, Sophie Maxwell, a elected member of the Board of Education, on social media promoting a campaign to, essentially advance the shipyard's development. Breed has a campaign platform as a candidate for mayor that centers solely on housing. She is, the housing at all costs candidate. I don't support her, and I don't support her because of a history of very unproductive, if not negative, interactions around her role as an advocate for the shipyard's development. I'm most specifically concerned about a change in the shipyard development plan that occurred in 2010. Someone changed the plan to create a South Shipyard multi-use district that actually sites residential development adjacent to that parcel E2 landfill that, as I mentioned, has pockets of methane gas greater than 50% volume in air, which is an explosive concentration, and that is idiotic. It is absolutely idiotic that someone would do that. My feeling is that London Breed, Malia Cohen are the only two people who would have been empowered to do that.
And there were actual fires.
Yes.
And talk about that. I mean, there was burning up of these toxic substances at the
shipyard parcel E2 landfill that the Navy is actually preparing for transfer this year and expects to generate a finding of suitability for transfer by 2019. They want to transfer it for open space, but as I mentioned, there was a change that would allow for the siting of residential development. Yes, it caught on fire in the year 2000. The Navy, the Department of Public Health, the City and County of San Francisco minimized the fire.
What was burning there? I mean, it was...
What's in the landfill, volatile organic compounds, lead, metals, things that are highly flammable. Methane gas is probably what perpetuated the smoldering of the landfill, because it smoldered for over 30 days. And again, it was a major incident.
So this is like a highly toxic dump, contaminated dump that was on fire?
A toxic contaminated dump. It has a Band-Aid on top of it, speaking metaphorically. And again, it has flammable substances in it. It's also subject to liquefaction in the event of an earthquake. It's also subject to having toxic substances migrate via groundwater within it. So these substances can still migrate. The Navy's plan is to build some walls to prevent that, migration. But it's a very, very dangerous structure, and it is absolutely idiotic to think that the Navy would transfer it to the city and county of San Francisco, and it is preposterous to think that the city and county of San Francisco would accept a toxic landfill in transfer.
It sounds like it's criminally negligent to take something like that and put human beings on it.
Without question. Yeah, it's without question, and I personally and politically will take a stance. I'm committed to, leading a campaign in opposition. I don't think it's going to go that way, that place, or to that, place, but it's important to remember that there were facility agreements that were signed many years ago that just keep these, parcels moving forward in their remediation and their development and their plan for transfer. And, it's like a brick and mortar institution, trying to get past it. There are very, very strong layers of contractual agreement that are hard to, think about breaking through. But I do think that is one area or one, red line that I think that we should all be prepared to take. And then, of course, the issue of residential development on property that we now know is radiation contaminated and the site of fraudulent, collection and clearance of radiation contaminated soil samples.
Now, as a result of the community yourself, many others, and Tetra Tech whistleblowers. The Navy was forced to hire some consultants to examine the quality of the testing. What was that all about?
The Navy brought in some consultants from the outside. I'm not sure how absolutely independent they were because they would have been compensated for their work. But ironically, the outside consultants found that there was even greater fraud involved in the radiological cleanup than had been identified by Tetra Tech in its internal report, published in 2012. So the Navy is planning a meeting for the first time in several months. Next Monday at 6 p.m. they will be offering a radiological update on operations. There are some subtle signals, however, that the city may be trying to move forward on accepting properties for their, intended purpose, quote unquote. And some of it may be, the political environment, the vacuum caused by Ed Lee's death, and, perhaps people are emboldened by the prospect of having, London Breed elected mayor, who would definitely be a candidate and a mayor who would, likely, strong arm the development through. But those are, some of the issues that I think everyone should be aware of.
And so the consultant makes a report that more than 50% of the testing was falsified. Federal funds, our tax dollars, were used to do all this testing. We're talking $1 billion remediation project, both in Hunters Point and Treasure Island, and yet there's been complete silence from Congresswoman Pelosi, from Senator Feinstein, from the politicians who were supposed to represent the people of San Francisco. How could that be? I mean, when
Pelosi has been publicly silent on the issue. Pelosi organized a tiger team in City Hall that brought together health department, developer, representatives, the district supervisor, and representatives of the mayor's office, and they have been challenged via public records requests to, produce minutes and proceedings from their meetings. But the Pelosi Tiger team was called specifically because Lennar had a drop in sales of the homes at the shipyard, and they were convened to see what could be done to prevent that loss in income. They weren't convened out of concern for the community's health and safety. They weren't convened, to analyze new data to decide whether or not it's even safe, to continue forward with the development plan. They were convened first and foremost, again, to protect the developer.
And these families that have bought homes in this project, should they be concerned about the health and safety of themselves and their children?
I know that they are. Again, Lennar did have a drop-off in sales. I was contacted many times. I was contacted inappropriately by people who, wanted to meet with me or talk with me or, sent me stories. I've got a site on Twitter that contacted me. It's called My Lennar Homes. And it's not Lennar affiliated. It is people, individuals, real people who bought Lennar homes all over the nation and are posting their horror stories. So it's not even a issue that is unique, to Hunters Point.
So Lennar has actually been involved in supposedly remediation of not just Hunters Point, which is a Superfund site, but many other highly toxic sites around the country. And in fact, they're not really cleaning them up, and people are moving into them, and
Some horror stories that would be impossible to believe. There was a story of a community that found it was a bomb. It was an actual bomb that was discovered, at the site of a former, military installation that had been brought into reuse for residential development and not fully, explored and remediated.
And this whole transfer of these sites, highly toxic, contaminated sites, is called the Brownsfield Act, where the developers say that we will clean these sites up and we'll save the government money. We'll take care of the remediation, and they can be put into civilian use. Has there been any kind of study as to what has happened to these sites that have been?
Well, these are not brownfields. These are superfunds. This is a level above a brownfield. The areas around the city, like Visitation Valley, the Cow Palace, that industrial area, those are, are brownfields. And there are brownfields, of course, in the southeast section of San Francisco is heavy industrialized. These properties fall under the CERCLA Act, the federal Superfund law that has multiple layers of regulatory control. But it doesn't mean anything if the cop on the beat is corrupt, and getting money, as a crook. And, that's what you got. We have emails that document communications that were going on between, the EPA, Department of Public Health, and the developer, to advance the, the transfer and remediation of these properties. These are emails that were obtained under the Freedom of Information Act in 2009. We've got a civil grand jury report, that identified that Amy Brownell is being paid by the developer and shouldn't be paid by the developer, and the city's liability, in that matter. We've got the Department of Toxic Substances Control now that doesn't want to even show up to community meetings because of fear of making a statement, that might go on a legal record in the aftermath, of the Tetra Tech fraud. So we have a lot of evidence of, corruption and collusion among the Navy, its contractors, and the regulators to advance the shipyard development and Treasure Island. And again, it is fueled by a great deal of, political will and momentum and conflict of interest.
And the Environmental Protection Agency are supposed to protect the environment, have been involved in this. What has there been their role at Hunters Point, Bayview, and Treasure Island?
Well, the former head of the Region 9 EPA, Mark Ruperta, lost his job as a result of the emails that I referenced that showed him clearly colluding with the developer. And they brought in another woman. Her name is Lily Lee. I've been in communication with her. Part of the tactic is to turn people over. The Navy turned over its BRAC coordinator. Derek Robinson is the new BRAC coordinator. So that is part of the tactic, too, to turn over personnel so that you don't have the historical memory. So you have people like me who have a historical memory. I've got digital and hard copy files. I've got virtually every hard copy document published by the Navy and Netra Tech around the Parcel A transfer. And then you have long-timers like, Amy Brownell in the Department of Public Health, Kofi Bonner, who's been able to hang on at Lennar. They changed their name, of course. Lennar changed its name. It developed a shell company called 5 Point as a result of all the negative information that you can get online about Lennar and its developments. And then you have people like, Willie Brown and Nancy Pelosi and Diane Feinstein who, just keep they just keep moving forward, and they are, fixtures and, overseers and overlords of the Hunters Point Shipyard development, and that's the bottom line.
And is it surprising? I mean, there's been a lot of coverage of the whistleblowers, of the complaints of neighborhood people, community people, that there is corruption, that people are getting sick, that it's an unsafe site. Yet it seems like the media hasn't really gone to Senator Feinstein and gone to Congresswoman Pelosi and said, what is your response? I mean, the idea that you have a $1 billion project and a large percentage of that was actually falsified, it's fraud, and there seems to be no focus on why haven't these politicians been held accountable to the fact that all this money has been wasted and there's still people getting sick and being retaliated against for trying to do their job as far as health.
No, you're right. There has not been accountability at the level of your state and federal public officials, period. And that is what it has to, come down to. No one, directs the conversation about the shipyard, to Nancy Pelosi. No one directs it to Diane Feinstein. Diane Feinstein actually led one of the shipyard development citywide campaigns, despite having clear, conflicts of interest. So, they remain protected. There's been some press. San Francisco Weekly did the expose on Willie Brown's role as former mayor and as probably a stockholder, and there are some, issues of, financial liability, vulnerability that, that he faces. So there's been a little bit of music, around Willie Brown's role. But Willie Brown has a protege in the mayor's race, London Breed, and one of the driving issues that has him so visible in this race is in protecting the development at the Hunters Point Shipyard. I'm sure of that. I'm absolutely sure that Willie Brown's very, very clear, very, very visible role in this mayor's race is in protecting the development at the Hunters Point Shipyard.
And the other candidates that are running, I mean, there is this drive, a lot of by developers for
Right.
at all costs,
Yes,
building
housing,
condos and $1 million condos and driving working class poor people,
Right.
Latin Americans, African Americans out of. But have the other candidates raised this issue of a possible moratorium or raised this issue of an investigation of the falsification of the testing?
No, there hasn't been any. There's not been any address of this issue by the candidates, as an issue. I've attended many of the major debates, and it actually starts to be kind of like a sing-along echo chamber. Is housing, 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 more housing, 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 homelessness, homelessness, homelessness. We need homes for the homeless people, and they can't afford them. We're going to build more houses to house the homeless people who lost their houses in San Francisco, and they can't afford them. So let's criminalize them. And immigration and car break-ins and things like that. There has been very little focus on other issues in general, but there has been no focus, whatsoever, specifically on the shipyard. When I ran for mayor in 2007, it was a symbolic run, but it did offer me a bully pulpit, an opportunity to bring to the public debate and dialogue, my concerns about what was going on. And at that time, we had the grading that was having a negative impact on the health and safety of the community and its children. But I am hoping that at some point it becomes an issue. Angela Alioto is the candidate that I believe can bring the most to the topic. Angela, of course, sued Lennar. There were some African American employees who charged racial discrimination, environmental injustice, and one of them, one of the males, was sick. He lost hair and had skin rashes and, cough, and he claimed that the Lennar administrators laughed at him publicly in a meeting. And Angela Alioto sued Lennar on behalf of the employees, and there was a settlement. And, I've have reached out to those employees but not been able to get a response because I'm sure that they signed a non-disclosure agreement. So my feeling is that if there is any candidate in the race who can really set her hair on fire around the issues with a history and a genuine, authentic commitment, who's not burdened by shipyard baggage, both London Breed and unfortunately, Mark Leno, who I support. Mark was involved in a transfer of, Candlestick Park that angered a lot of community residents. A segment of Candlestick Park was transferred to Lennar developers for development. So I think that Angela is the candidate in the race who has the opportunity to bring the greatest bully pulpit, response to what's going on.
But you believe that all the candidates should really be, at this point, calling for a moratorium of the development of Hunters Point Bayview Naval Shipyard and Treasure Island?
Yes, I don't think that you could get that statement. Jane Kim now chairs land use for the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. Jane Kim is in a position to take a stance on this issue. Jane Kim came under a lot of fire for her response initially to the Treasure Island residents who were claiming that they were sick and exposed to radiation. And I think that, like a lot of people, she minimized that. The regulators were saying we don't think it's a big problem. But now, in retrospect, it's real clear that there are segments on that island that are radiation contaminated, and we should be thinking about possibly relocating, those residents. So Jane Kim has an investment in the issue.